Привет! Hello, tubers and connoisseurs of fine Imperial, Russian, and Soviet military. We're here today for another episode from CollectRussia.com. Igor, what do you have for us today?
We have a really exciting subject. In my opinion, one of the most interesting campaigns of Second World War on the Soviet side, and that's Medal for the Defence of Sevastopol. And I have to say, we've already covered this medal just very briefly in one of our early episodes when we spoke about early Soviet campaign medals. And there are several, of course. Medal for the Defense of Leningrad, Medal for the Defense of Moscow, and a couple of others, including Sevastopol and Odessa. And Sevastopol really has a very special place, and I will cover today, or at least try to the best of my ability, the prehistory, what made this location so important, Crimea in general as a very important area for both the Soviets and Germans. We will talk about how the campaign developed, meaning from the early days when Sevastopol got besieged and what actually transpired and how Germans were finally able to break through. And of course, the characteristics of the medal itself. It's one of the most desirable Soviet World War II campaign medals, one of the better known campaigns. For some of the bad reasons, actually, we know what's going on with Crimea, with occupation of Crimea by the Russians. And who would ever think that this could happen? But many of the locations we will be discussing today are now known to American viewers and viewers in the West, maybe for the wrong reasons, unfortunately. But during the war, this was as important area as it is today. So it does deserve a coverage, I think, in more depth than what we did previously. And by the way, if you look up, there is a link to our previous episode where we discussed this medal very, very briefly. But now we want to go into details. And of course, because the medal is desirable, because it's one of the most scarce campaign medals for the Soviets at least, it's very widely faked. And today we have what I would call a perfect fake. And it's perfect, I have to admit. I don't want to make it a clickbait. It's not perfect because it's so difficult to tell that this is a fake. No, it's actually the opposite. It's a fake that, yes, made somewhat professionally, made to fool, and it has the age. It came from a very old American collection, unfortunately. The person who owned it didn't know that this was a forgery. But it combines in it so many different sides of fakes that it's just a perfect study example. You can see all those characteristics that you may not necessarily find on all the fakes.
In one fake.
In one
Perfect.
piece. So everything is wrong with it,
and
we will go in
right
detail over all of those wrong
Wonderful.
things. And of course, we will also talk about medals we've had in the past, variations of original medals. That's very important to know. And also size, weight, things that we always have to touch on, and just very briefly the prices. So the entire panoply. It will take time, so right off the get-go, I must say, for people who are watching this, remember, we have timestamps on all of our videos. So if you are not interested in, say, history of Sevastopol as a city, as a fortification, as a naval base, if you are not interested in other details, say, World War II campaign and how it actually developed, the German siege, and who participated in the siege, and back and forth, you don't need to watch the whole thing. You can just go straight to the part that interests you, and we will have all those parts marked out. So if you just want to hear about the details of the medal, you're welcome to it. If you want to see just the fake and comparison between fake and original, you can go straight to that part.
Excellent.
But I will cover as much as I can, as much ground as I can, because I think this is really important. And for many people, this may be new. You can certainly find a lot of this information and much more online and history books, but it will take time. I try to combine what I find, condense it into a manageable, somewhat manageable story, and hopefully that's what we'll do today. And we will have to start from the beginning.
Outstanding. Let's go.
Okay, so starting from the beginning. What was Sevastopol and how the city even appeared on the map? The history goes back well over 200 years. And it started, actually even before then, in ancient history. There was a Greek colony, one of many, on the coast of the Black Sea, which was to the large extent controlled by Greece or Greek city-states for much of the ancient history that we know. And there was a particular place on the southern side, southwestern side of Crimean Peninsula, which is, as we know, is a large peninsula that juts into the Black Sea. It's a very big area. There was a little spot on it that was called that is called now Cape Chersones, and there was a Chersones colony. It's called this way even now, after the Greek city, little Greek colony that existed there, starting from about 5th century BC. Russians always had Crimea in, so to speak, crosshairs in more modern history because it was an important location. Also, it was a source of constant aggression against Russian southern territories. It was occupied by Tartars, by Crimean Tartars, that were descendants, you could say, of the Great Horde, of the Great Mongolian invasion of Middle Ages. And they were keeping this southern area of Russia, what would become Russia and Ukraine, under pressure all the time. There were constant invasions. It was very difficult to conduct normal affairs, trade or agriculture, even though the land is fabulously rich. Some of the best agricultural soil in the world is in that general area. It's up Dnieper. It's wonderful because it's not a subject to harsh weather like much of Russian Empire is. So it was a very desirable area, but to really keep it safe and to develop industries and towns, Russians had to deal with the occupants of Crimea, the Tartars. And they were Muslims by large, so for that reason opposed to Russia. That was Orthodox Christian, of course. And at different times they were under suzerainty of Ottoman Empire, which was a great competitor, of course, for influence with the Russian Empire. They had pretty extensive common border, so this was a point of contention. So to make this story short, by the end of 18th century, at the time of Catherine the Great, who is called the Great for a reason. She expanded Russian territories tremendously and improved many things under her reign, as brutal as she was, and with all her negative qualities. But Catherine the Great was, among other things, the founder of the city of Sevastopol, which was initially a military outpost, a fort, built by the Generalissimo or Field Marshal Suvorov, one of the, if not the largest, the most famous of Russian military commanders, who supposedly never lost any battles. Not sure about that, but in any case, it's notable that Suvorov was the person in charge who founded the city, and later it developed pretty quickly into a military port, into naval port, first and foremost. In a few years after its founding in 1783, Catherine herself felt safe enough to visit with a great retinue, with Austrian Emperor in her entourage, among other
Wow.
people, some other royals from Europe and notables. And now it was a fully fledged city. And by the way, much later in Soviet times, this event, the founding of Sevastopol, was celebrated by a Soviet medal. And Soviets were none too fond of celebrating any czars. So Catherine,
That's
of
what I'm
course,
thinking.
Catherine was, of course, never mentioned there. But the medal appeared 200 years later in 1983. A bronze medal. By the way, we had one recently on our website. And it just goes to show that this was an important event. And of course, Sevastopol played a very important role as a key naval port, the home of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. Now, Russian Black Sea Fleet was one of the major Russian forces, naval forces. The other were Baltic Fleet and Pacific Fleet, and each played its own role. Black Sea Fleet was important to control Russian coast of the Black Sea, the northern coast of Black Sea, access to the Caucasus. It provided safe access, and of course protecting Russian ports, and among other things, conveying safe trade via Bosphorus and Dardanelles into Mediterranean. And that actually what later led to a conflict, because Russian fleet based at Sevastopol became a danger to Western powers. And one of the reasons for the first siege of Sevastopol, and I don't know if many of our viewers know that, but there were two medals for the defense of Sevastopol. The first one preceded the second one by some 150 years. It was a medal that was awarded to Russian defenders in the war, ironically, against the British and French, who were Russian Soviet allies much later in the Second World War. So and I want to touch a little bit on history of these events. But before we get to that, I would like to just briefly show the map of the area. So we know the locations, we understand where they are, and it's a little bit better to visualize for our viewers how those things developed and where everything is on the map. And for that I got frustrated with trying to find a decent map online that would be free and I don't have to pay a huge royalty for it. So I drew in my own very primitive way a sketch of the map. Now, don't laugh. It's going to be pretty primitive.
It looks so much better than what I could have done.
And it's, well, I don't know.
Oh, true.
So in any case, it's not to scale, so don't make much of it, but it will just help a little bit to visualize the area. And why don't we show it here? And I will try to explain where things are and where Sevastopol is in particular. And now, ladies and gentlemen, here we have it, a very primitive map by Igor Moiseev himself. Sorry for the quality, but for our purposes, I think it should work. I just want to show what Crimea is and where those locations are, especially Sevastopol. Here's the tip of the southern tip of Crimean Peninsula. This is where Sevastopol is located. You can see that it's facing west, and it's a very important area, a very important seaport, because Crimea doesn't really have very many. The other ones of note are at Yevpatoria, another place that was built, I believe, under Catherine the Great's reign. Yalta, you may have heard of it if you remember Yalta Conference, where the meeting took place closer to the end of the Second World War, where European powers were deciding what to do with Europe, how to divide the world, essentially. United States, Stalin was there, as you know. And then there is Kerch, of course. It became very infamous recently because this is the place where Crimean Peninsula is very close to the mainland, and this is where Putin built his bridge, which connects this Taman area, Taman Peninsula, and then Caucasus is farther to the south and east to Crimea. And Beside that, so there is Kerch, there is Yalta, Balaklava is a famous location if you know history of Crimean War of Russia against French and British empires. Then Sevastopol is here, Evpatoria. And just as a general area, Kherson, again, a city that we've heard about in the news, unfortunately too much for the wrong reasons. Nikolaev, where big shipyards are located now, this is all southern part of Ukraine. City of Odessa, another very important port, and this is where another important campaign took place. In fact, a lot of troops from Odessa that were defending Odessa against the Germans relocated eventually to Sevastopol and fought again. Sea of Azov, which is basically an inlet, a very large part of Black Sea, which is, goes to the south. Bay of Taganrog, Melitopol. This is again just to familiarize yourself with the area. This is an interesting part. This is a long spit of sand called Arbat Spit, which connects Crimean Peninsula with the mainland. There are a couple of straits here, and this was one of the possible ways to get into Crimea. In fact, Bolsheviks used this during the Russian Civil War in the attack on the white holdouts, the last territory held of note, of importance, held by the white troops, by the so-called White Guards, during the Russian Civil War. Perikop is the place where peninsula connects to the mainland. Everywhere else, it's just sea or straits. This is so-called Sivash. It's the basically
they call it the
Dead Sea.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. It's it has outlets, so it connects with the Sea of Azov, but it's very high salinity, very high mineral content. There is not much that lives there, and it's basically a saltwater lagoon.
I spent summers there in Genichisk, actually.
Genichisk would be right
yes,
here, right?
Right there, at the beginning of the Arabatska Street. And the fishing in the Dead Sea was awesome.
Oh, well, yes, I remember Bichki. It's a Turkish
Not only. This is where Kefal goes.
Oh, Kefal goes in there?
Yes, and then in September or very late August, it just rushes through that little strait back into the Azov Sea. And I witnessed an idiot who went out. People just brought their, shopping bags and just dipped them in the water and pulled them out full of fish.
Unbelievable.
Yeah. And that idiot decided he got greedy and he took his rowboat into the middle of that little strait. He was pushed out into the sea. He couldn't do anything.
That's funny.
By the fish.
So anyhow, ladies and gentlemen, this is, again, returning to our subject of Sevastopol. It was named by Catherine, or at least on her approval. The name harkens back to Greek time, to ancient Greece. Sevastopol, if you know the name Sebastian, it means of note. And polis is Greek for the city. So it was put together. And Russians, when they were naming those new locations, new cities that they were building around Crimea, wanted to make a connection to ancient Greeks. And this is why Sevastopol is called Sevastopol. So now we are switching back to the story of Crimean War, number one, which is Russia against the major European powers. And why did it happen? Well, Russia at the time was up and coming, was really waxing important, and of course it was a result of many prior developments, such as the victory over Napoleon, in which Russia played a very major role. Then Russian troops and Russian army was very highly respected and feared. Russia was at that time, under the Emperor Nicholas I, called the gendarme or policeman of Europe. And they were instrumental in really driving European policy. Of course, that didn't please other European powers, not too much. And another point of contention between Russia and the others was that Russia was really meddling a lot in the affairs of Palestine. It was very important to Russian prestige, and they were considered themselves at the time protectors of Orthodox Christianity. Mm-hmm. And if you remember, Palestine, former Israel, was under the control of Ottoman Turks at the time. And they were allowing access for Christians. They were allowing Christian churches in Jerusalem, some Christian activities and monasteries, that probably to avoid another crusade, which they would lose. So that was taken care of, sort of, but not to Russian satisfaction, because when there was a satisfactory agreement with Catholic Christians, Russia considered Eastern Orthodox Christians being kind of trampled upon by the Turks. And there was a series of negotiations. Another point of contention, of course, was the Caucasus. The Caucasus, the border which is to the east and south of here, between Turkey and Russian Empire, was unsettled. And yet another place where Russians were intervening was the protectorates under Turkish kind of suzerainty, you could say, of Wallachia and Moldavia. And Moldavia, we now know it's an independent state. Right. But back then, there were two principalities near the Danube River, along the Danube. One of them, Moldova, and another Wallachia. And Russia decided to take control over those principalities, invaded, basically, took them over without much trouble. And Turks were, of course, incensed over that. Negotiations led to nothing, and eventually in 1853, a real war broke out between Russia and Turkish Empire. And initially the other countries, France and Britain in particular, were kind of on the sidelines. They were, however, pursuing the interests of Turkey first for a number of reasons. One, you could say, they were the biggest lenders to the Porta, or right. Turkish government. Turkey was already a sick man of Europe. They were on the decline, on their terminal decline as an empire, and they were ready to be attacked. But French and British thought that they would rather preserve Turkey in its current state, continue to lend money to the bankrupt government and bankrupt system, and enjoy the benefits. And Russian interference wasn't to their liking a bit. So Turkey initially had some success in pressing Russians in the Caucasus. They were also able to supply forces that were in the Caucasus, that were hostile to Russia, using their fleet. So their fleet was very important, carrying supplies back and forth. And that was actually against the international law. So French and British had to concede that as long as Russia stays on the defensive in this war, they would remain neutral. But they didn't want Russia to go on the offensive. Russia, on the other hand, declared that Russian army wouldn't fight with one hand tied behind its back, and they decided to go full force. And one of the major developments was the activity of the Russian fleet based right here in Sevastopol. Now, with that, initially not very successful trying to catch the Turkish ships, but Russia had a serious advantage at that point. First of all, it was commanded by a very capable Admiral Nakhimov. And he, of course, would become the hero of Sevastopol defense, and he would be tragically killed there. But in 1853, he was very instrumental in actually catching the good portion of Turkish fleet that arrived way to the south of the very southern shore of the Black Sea. There was a port of Sinop where Turks would take refuge against the Russian ships trying to catch them. And eventually Russians succeeded at that. Another big advantage that Russians had over Turks was, of course, the quality of their ships and especially of their guns. By that time, Russia was fully converting to use of high explosive ships, shells for naval warfare. And that was a pretty revolutionary innovation. Right. They first appeared invented by French in 1820s, but initially they were only used for siege warfare, and people didn't really know how to use explosive shells in regular naval warfare. It was considered very dangerous. Finally, there was a breakthrough, innovative breakthrough, and those guns became safe to use even on naval ships. And Russia was one of the first powers to actually fully implement them. And that was a very nasty surprise to the Turks, who were still using balls, smoothbore artillery on their ships. And of course, their ships were, most of them at least, were all wooden construction. There were very few steamers. Steamers were already coming into play. And Russia, with their very new modern fleet, with a number of battleships, full-size battleships, some of them were 120-gun battleships of the first rate. They blockaded the Turks at Sinop. Turks at that point only had some frigates, a good number of them, but all, of course, wooden frigates of all construction, and it was an absolute slaughter. Absolute slaughter. There were a number of paintings even that immortalized this event. A couple of them, at least, that I know of, by the famous maritime artist Ayvazovsky, and some others, where Turkish ships literally go up in flames. It was a total annihilation. You can compare it, I guess, with Tsushima much later or Trafalgar earlier. But it was a complete devastation for the Turks, and Russians, to add to the Turk misery, kept the city under fire for several days after that, completely smashed all the shore batteries. The Turks relied upon unsuccessfully to stop the Russians, and in the end it was a very one-sided victory because Russians didn't lose any ships. They lost maybe something like 40 people dead, more or less, and a couple of 150 maybe wounded. But Turkish losses were terrible. Thousands of men dead or maimed, and all the ships lost, with the exception, I think, of one frigate broke out and fled. In any case, that led to a major conflagration, because now the French and British declared war on the Russian Empire. And this war, which is known as Crimean War in the West, it would take several years. By the next year, the British and French were already harassing the Russian ports, especially in the Sea of Azov, going as far as the Bay of Taganrog, the city of Taganrog, which was a little farther to the north and east, which was a major supply hub, went as far as Rostov, laid a siege to it unsuccessfully, one have to say, but there was a lot of activity going on, not just in Crimea, but around it. There was also activity in the Caucasus, where the war continued between Russia and Turkey, and now Russia had the upper hand and was able to capture an important Turkish fortress of Kars. There were other areas and other theaters of war as far as the Far East even. There was fighting there near Petropavlovsk. There was fighting in the Baltic Sea. So it's far beyond beyond the immediate area and the Crimea, but we concentrate on Crimea because this is where the main events took place. And Sevastopol was one of that main events, the siege of Sevastopol. How it progressed? Well, the British and French landed on the coast near Sevastopol. There was a battle of Alma River fought there, where Russians tried to intercede with that and weren't successful, were repelled. And then the Sevastopol, the fortress of Sevastopol, came under siege. It took many months and many casualties on both sides. It was not easy at all. And Nakhimov, the famous hero who defeated the Turkish fleet, was in charge of the defense of the city. City was very well fortified. And as the siege went on, new fortifications were constantly added. A lot of naval guns from now blockaded Russian port were brought ashore and used on those fortifications. There was another very famous battle that I'm sure many viewers have heard of, Battle of Balaclava, where Balaclava is a location which the Allies used as a port to supply their armies besieging Sevastopol. So here it is, not too far from Sevastopol. There was a battle fought there, which was, you could say, a victory for the Russians. Maybe not in strategic terms, but in at least tactical terms. And some of the events of that battle became extremely famous, became really a matter of lore. And you've heard, of course, of Thin Red Line. It comes from there, where a thin line, why it was thin, is because the British unit that resisted Russian cavalry attack was such small in numbers that they had to put soldiers in two ranks.
Because of their uniforms?
And red because of their uniforms, of course. They put them in two lines, and this was a Scottish unit, and they withstood this massive cavalry attack of the numbers that was incomparable to this. I think it was 500 against 2,500 or something, or 300 against 2,500. I'm sure, I'm not a historian of that war. I'm sure you can find out a lot about it, but this is where Thin Red Line came from. Another one is the Charge of Light Brigade. It's immortalized in Tennyson's poem, and Rudyard Kipling wrote a poem about it, and of course there are numerous movies and books about this, and of course it was enormously heroic on the side of the British, for no good reason, of course. The charge was suicidal, and it's a miracle that any of them returned alive, actually. A case of very poor command and miscommunication on the British side. But Balaclava didn't save Sevastopol. The siege progressed. The besiegers suffered terribly because of Russian sniping, because of constant shelling from the fortress, because of the miserable weather. And people may not know, but Crimea is not all that wonderful all the time. Much of the peninsula is a desert. It's very mountainous, first of all. It's very dry. Finding water there is a constant problem for the population there and for agriculture. And it's not always so cozy and warm. I'm sure you've been there in the summer. Me too. I was actually there as a counselor at the children's camp right there on the Arbat Spit. Yeah, and it was great in the summer, but in the winter it can be very miserable. It can be rainy and snow occasionally and frost even. So the besiegers experienced full force of it, and they had all kinds of diseases that they suffered from, typhoid and so forth. They decimated really the army much more than Russian action. But they went on, and again there was a Battle of Inkerman, another famous engagement, where Russians tried to besiege the garrison. It was actually a two-pronged attack, one from outside, one from inside. There was a foray. It was it was a pretty close call, but in the end, French and British won. And then the final stage of the siege in the summer of 1855, Nakhimov, Admiral Nakhimov, the hero defender, gets killed by a sniper's bullet while manning the bastion. And within a month, the city is taken, captured, stormed. Again, very heroically on both sides. There was a series of fortifications, and I want to show approximately where they're located related to the rest of the city. So this is, again, my hand-drawn map. Please don't judge too harshly, but perhaps we can turn it a little bit like this. There we go. And you can see this is the main Sevastopol harbor called Severnaya Bay. This is the location of the naval fleet. This is especially this one is so-called Корабельная or Ship's Bay, Корабельная бухта. The city itself, it was much smaller. It's drawn here very primitively, of course, by me, but this is approximate World War II map of the city, of the outline of the city. Cape Chersones, remember we mentioned that, the old Greek colony. And here's Balaclava to the south, and Inkerman, where the decisive battle, you could say, was fought. Sapun Heights, very important area, elevated area, which is all dissected by the gullies, very difficult to approach, and very important place later in World War II at least. But on the outskirts of the city proper, a number of forts, and one of them was called Malachov, the center, really, the heart of the city's defenses at that time. Malachov Kurgan.
Yep.
Then to the south of it was so-called Great Redan, or V-shaped fortification, which was very fiercely defended. And to the north, another small Redan. All of those were stormed. Malachov was taken by the French, believe it or not. British were actually repulsed in their attempt to capture the Great Redan. They captured it actually for a couple of hours, were thrown back by the Russian bayonet charge. Russians were out of ammunition at that point. Wow. They were still able to storm in mass and made such a spirited attack that British were driven back. But at that point, it was all lost, pretty much. There was no point even trying, because the Malachov, the heart of the city defenses, was lost. The small Redan was lost to the north. This position was untenable. So Russians left it. The Highlanders, the Scots, were the ones who occupied what remained of the Grand Redan, and Russians evacuated to the north, set the city on fire, and shortly before that they sank all their ships that were blockaded here to deny access to the Brits and French to the harbor, the use of the harbor. The harbor now became useless for at least a while, and there is still a famous monument to the sunk ships of the Black Sea. But end result of the war, of course, Russia was forced to accept the peace treaty, which took another a few months. It was only signed next year. So the war ended in 1856 with Russian defeat, already under a different emperor. The one who started was Nicholas I. It's Alexander II who continued after Nicholas's death and who made peace, finally. Russian government issued a special medal for this campaign, not just for the campaign in the war, which was awarded, there was a medal for that, medal for the Crimean War, actually two medals, one in light bronze or in brass, and another one in so-called dark bronze, which is really copper. Some 1.7 million was struck. So it just gives you an idea of how big this entire war was. Again, not limited to just Crimea. There were actions all over the place. But there was also a special medal just for the defenders of Sevastopol. And everyone who took part, even enlisted men, which was actually uncharacteristic for the era, would receive medals. Equally, officers, enlisted generals, any rank would receive the same medal. And it was the first medal for the defense of Sevastopol. In silver, there were approximately 250,000 of them struck at the mint, at the Russian mint. There were quite a few additionally made by private makers. Anyone who was eligible could order this medal from a private maker, a second or third, or however he pleased, whatever number he pleased. So this medal is still around, and maybe someday we will feature it in one of our episodes. Yeah, I think it certainly deserves it. Wonderful, nicely designed, nice artwork, Russian Imperial medal. But now let's fast forward to Second World War. Now that we are done with the Crimean War, let's fast forward and go 100 years almost ahead into the 20th century. So now we are in the middle of the Barbarossa campaign. The Germans were initially very successful, as we now know, and they had very ambitious plans to reach Caucasus in as early as 1941, to take Moscow, to capture Leningrad. We now know that they didn't really succeed in any of those goals, but they did have very significant achievements.
Right.
And on the wings of that early successes, the next plan is to capture Crimea, because Crimea, we remember, is a very important area. It puts them within reach, at least by air, of Caucasian oil fields. It definitely gives the Germans, whoever controls Crimea, controls to a large extent the Black Sea. And of course, Germans wanted to annihilate the Black Sea, Soviet Black Sea fleet, which was certainly a thorn in their side. And it fared much better in the initial period of the war than, say, Baltic fleet, which was marooned at that point in Leningrad,
sitting there
in
useless,
Kronstadt, yes.
Right.
But Admiral Oktyabrski, who was in charge of the Sevastopol defense in particular, and in general the Black Sea fleet, he was very capable, and he put the fleet on high alert even before the German attack, because he knew it was coming, it was imminent. So despite all the assurances to the contrary from the Soviet high command, despite Stalin's almost maniacal denial of what was to be coming, and his insistence that there would be no provocation on the side of the Soviets, Black Sea fleet was ready. So they started acting very early. They were very successful initially in repelling German aerial attacks. And they were a serious consideration all throughout the initial months of the war, because they were able to, as much as assault German positions or Romanian positions in Romania, as a matter of fact. Like Constanța was brought under fire. Soviet submarines of the Black Sea Fleet were a constant threat. And of course, they had some very serious ships, such as large destroyers and cruisers. And all of that made it very necessary to capture the Crimea. And Germans were successful in that part of their 1941 campaign. They overwhelmed Crimea so quickly that it was almost astonishing. And there was only one single German army acting in Crimea, the 11th Army. It faced an entire Soviet front. It collapsed it within weeks. And by early November, they were within reach of 1941. They were within the reach of Sevastopol, which would be unthinkable. And of course, Sevastopol was of key importance for defense of Crimea in general and for the fleet, the main base of the Soviet Black Sea Fleet. So now the Germans are there. They haven't really started the attack yet because they were not ready. They didn't have any siege equipment and so forth. And they knew they would be fighting against a very entrenched location. They knew about fortification. Of course, they learned the lessons of the Crimean War of 100 years ago. And their focus was initially to occupy the entirety of the peninsula. And that would include the eastmost part of it, which is Kerch Peninsula, extension of Crimea towards the east, it juts towards east, as we saw on the map, and it almost connects there with the general Caucasus area, Taman Peninsula, and then Caucasus beyond that, Kubani area and Caucasus. So Crimea was practically all occupied except for that isthmus. And now December is coming, and December was the time when, even in Crimea, the weather is very unpredictable and sometimes very nasty and very cold. And Soviets used whatever time they had to strengthen the defenses. And in Sevastopol itself, there was a special maritime group, it was called, or coastal group, or coastal army, whose function, the only function, was protecting Sevastopol. So quite a lot of troops. And you can see in Soviet sources and even modern Russian sources that there were only 106,000 or so of Soviet troops in Sevastopol, that they were facing almost 3 times or 2.5 times as many German troops. It's all a lie. Absolutely not true. Soviets certainly had far more people there, possibly as many as 188,000 by the next year, by May for certain of 1942. And there were reinforcements brought in all throughout the campaign, up until the very end of the defense of Sevastopol, which took many months. The previous campaign, by the way, took approximately 11 months in the 19th century, 1850s, 1853 through 54. The Soviet campaign, Soviet defense took a little less. Sevastopol resisted for about 8 months or so. But it was still very, very impressive amount of time, and practically throughout the entire defense, Soviet Black Sea Fleet was bringing reinforcements, constant stream of reinforcements into the city. So there were far more of Soviet troops there than Soviet sources ever claimed. They, as usual, they kind of go funny with the facts. They use parts of the facts that are convenient, and they somehow conveniently set aside all the rest. So 106 were at some given point in time, of course not counting reinforcements, and probably just what they called line units, meaning the army cadres, regular army personnel, but that wouldn't include, of course, naval personnel. That wouldn't include naval infantry. It wouldn't include NKVD. It wouldn't include a whole number of things. It wouldn't include workers' militia, units formed within the city. Most certainly wouldn't include Air Force of the Black Sea and elsewhere that was supporting in the defense, and on and on and on and on. So the real facts are very different. And we can surmise it from the many available sources. As far as the Germans, as I said, the 11th Army, it had 3 corps within it. Soviets later claimed that the losses to Germans were tremendous, as many as 150,000 casualties. Again, absolute fantasy, impossible, simply because if you look at the numbers, how many troops entire German force in Crimea, not just in Sevastopol, but elsewhere, everywhere, had, we are talking 1 army, we are talking 3 corps. Each corps consisted of anywhere from 3 to 4 divisions. And if you count the number of people, of troops in the German division at the time was about maybe 12,000 men, 12,500 in a regular infantry division. And we are talking infantry divisions, they didn't have, at least initially, they didn't have very substantial tank forces there. So you combine all of that, it's about 10 times 12,000. So maybe 125,000 is all that they had. And I'm sure some of those units were already under strength, because they had to fight their way into Crimea. It took quite a while to defeat the Soviet troops in Kiev, for example, in the Kiev area, the huge catastrophe of Southwestern Front. It wasn't free for the Germans. And their initial attack through Odessa, it cost them lives and material, and it wasn't easy at all. So Soviets were resisting very, very seriously. So we can assume that by the time they got to Sevastopol, there were far fewer of them. But be it as it may, it was a very capable force. And guess who was the commander of that force? A pretty famous guy, Manstein. Manstein, who would later, following the final capture of Sevastopol, months later, would become a field marshal, and he obtained some fame and his counterattack following the Battle of Stalingrad and his attempted relief of Stalingrad, when he almost broke into the city to reunite with the surrounded Polish army. But that fame, part of that fame, came out of his performance as the commander at Sevastopol, as the German Nazi commander. Soviets had very impressive fortifications, as we already know, some of them dating back to the Crimean War, but they built some new ones and very modern forts. They were located farther from the city than the original forts, such as Malachov. There were batteries, very, very modern batteries of heavy naval guns. There were 12 batteries initially, and then Oktyabrskij, as I said, he was a very capable leader on the Soviet side. He added more from the Soviet cruisers that were disabled, Black Sea cruisers that were disabled by German Luftwaffe. And those guns formed additional batteries. So in total, there were 20 batteries of guns. In just the initial ones, there were 46 heavy naval guns. There were some 200 anti-aircraft pieces. The city was brimming with armor and weapons. So not an easy nut to crack at all for the Germans. They tried. The first defensive ring that was about 27 miles long, second defensive ring about 23 miles long, and then the final one that was already on the outskirts of the city, which was considered the main defensive line. The first two were anchored just outside on the southern tip of the line. They were anchored just near Balaklava, you know, the famous location. One, the outer ring, just to the north of it, and the second ring just to the south. And then the inner ring, again, very impressive and just packed with machine guns, mortars, you name it, anti-tank guns, everything. A lot of them in very seriously prepared emplacements of concrete and iron in pillboxes. So Germans tried, and almost beyond belief, they almost broke through. They broke through actually through all three lines in December of 1941. 17 December is when they started their real assault, and there were Romanians assisting them within the Crimean force, a mountain corps of Romanians, and two German, properly German corps. I think it's 65th and 35th, attacking from different sides. One of the divisions actually was already beyond the third final line of defense when it got stopped cold, and they couldn't advance any further. They were in fact thrown back. At that point, Soviets were already prepared to launch the counteroffensive of their own in Crimea. And as you know, December was a very bad, generally, time, December of 1941, for the Germans. What happened is their offensive initially in Leningrad suffered a setback because the Soviets were able to recapture the railway juncture of Tikhvin. In early December of 1941, the great Soviet counteroffensive at Moscow began, and Germans were immediately suffering from its effects. So there they had a reversal. Even before that, at Rostov, they had to retreat some 30 miles under the pressure of the Soviet army because they got overextended. That's back in November even of 1941. So by December 41, situation was getting pretty grim. Now, Crimea, of course, they didn't suffer from the horrible weather from the horrible winter, but it was still unenvious to the troops besieging Sevastopol. Right. It was still miserable. And what's worse for them, the Kerch Strait that separates Soviet mainland, Soviet interior from Crimea on the eastern end of the Crimean Peninsula got frozen, or partly frozen. So Soviets were able to bring reinforcements across the strait. There was no Crimean bridge then, but there was short enough distance that the troops could come ashore. It wasn't permanent bridge, of course, but at times they were able to cross, and they were bringing massive reinforcements, readying for the attack, and also for the amphibious landings. They were planning massive amphibious operation for the December. That operation, unfortunately for Oktyabrskij and his troops, got delayed by several days. And the reason for the delay was that massive, very serious, very dangerous German assault on Sevastopol proper. So they had to take some of those forces that were slotted for the amphibious landings and attack from the Kerch Isthmus to be relocated for the defense of Sevastopol. So that upset Soviet timetable, but nevertheless, in late December, the attack started. And it immediately scored some successes. And the biggest of them was the amphibious landing at Feodosia. On 26 December, the initial attack only captured many small locations around the Kerch Peninsula, along the shore. And Germans were planning to basically wipe them out one by one, because this was not a continuous front. It was just many separate landings, because remember, Soviets were never really fully prepared for naval warfare. It's not like United States, like American Navy, nothing of the kind. They didn't have the amphibious landing ships, for example. So all the reinforcement had to be brought in, all the landing parties had to be brought in by small craft, by torpedo boats and such. Not even by bigger ships. Bigger ships could assist, but they had to stay offshore because they couldn't come close. So because of that, initially it didn't look very critical, but then another thing happened. Soviets landed a major force at the port of Feodosia. And if you look at Feodosia, it's one of the 5 major ports that existed at that time that were absolutely critical for Crimea. One was Sevastopol. The other one on the southern shore, held by the Germans, was Yalta. There was Yevpatoria to the north, on the western shore of Crimean Peninsula, and then Feodosia and Kerch. Kerch remained in Soviet hands. Sevastopol remained in Soviet Kerch. Now Feodosia is coming under attack, and it was captured very quickly because troops that were there were mostly rear echelons or engineers, and they had no idea of how to handle the situation. Romanians that were with them immediately fled. Soviets had trouble because breeches of their guns froze all of a sudden, so they couldn't withstand the Soviet tank assault that was coming. They had to move back. So eventually it almost became a rout. And Germans were a headlong retreat from the not only Kerch Peninsula, Isthmus of Kerch, but into the entire peninsula. So Germans were under a real threat of getting isolated. The besieger could become besieged themselves, and they would be facing a sort of anvil and hammer. From one side attacked by the eastern Soviet forces, and on the left flank by the troops sallied out of Sevastopol, because that was part of the plan. So eventually Manstein was able to kind of stem this bloodletting and isolated the Feodosia pocket. But it was at the cost of pretty serious effort. One German division, 46th Infantry, actually got practically routed. Its commander got court-martialed because Hitler was absolutely livid. It was considered cowardice. A lot of German troops, uncharacteristically, were scattered and were never, for a while, to be found. So he had to threaten his troops, Manstein, with summary judgment, with being shot if they don't report to their units within a couple of days, by early January. So that's what measures it took. So this is how precarious German position in Crimea all of a sudden became because of the Soviet very successful, partly initially, assault at Feodosia and out of Kerch. By January, situation started to change again. Manstein, you could almost say panicked, but he definitely called a lot of attention to the situation. He was promised and actually given some reinforcements. And one thing he didn't realize is that Luftwaffe was extraordinarily successful. He didn't know the full extent of that success in destroying the Soviet traffic along the Kerch Road. So it was literally a highway of death. It was littered with burned out hulks of Soviet vehicles. And it was very difficult for the Soviets to navigate through this jam. So the pockets, the one in Feodosia and the others, remained kind of static. They didn't link together very successfully. They did not advance further into the interior. And another thing that worked in German favor is they were fully prepared now for the Soviet offensive. They knew the extent of it, even in Crimea. And they rushed reinforcements just in time of the next Soviet landing. And the next landing would come at Yevpatoria. If Germans lost Yevpatoria, imagine Sevastopol kind of isolated in the corner in the southwestern corner of Crimea. Then to the north of it is Yevpatoria, to the east of it is Feodosia. If those two ports, the latter were captured by the Soviets, and they are bringing massive reinforcements from the east through Kerch, then Germans would be doomed. Because there would be just a line of them in front of the city that was still fiercely resisted, very, very well equipped, and counterattacking actually at that point. So fortunately for the Germans, they were able to prevent that from happening. There was an infantry division rushed to the port. They met the Soviet assault well in time, and Soviets were never able to gain a foothold there. And then the warfare became very static. It was almost like the First World War from that point on. There was the Soviet line that got pushed back, and now the Soviet troops occupied this very static position at the base of Kerch Isthmus. All the rest of it was in Soviet hands. Yes, they were bringing reinforcements. They had their own fortifications. Germans tried to attack one more time there after receiving a good amount of tank reinforcements. Guess what? That attack miserably failed. They lost something like 32 tanks within hours. We have a situation where Germans are pretty much back at the starting point. Soviets are trying to attack once again. We are now into February, and there is a somewhat successful Soviet counterattack that drives Romanians, again, the weak link in the German Axis line. They are driven back some 7 miles on the northern part of the isthmus. So the position, Soviet position on the isthmus of Kerch expands a little bit, but not quite enough to break into the Crimea interior. By that time, Feodosia is safely back in German hands. Yes, Soviets are bringing more reinforcements, and now they even occupy the position that extends to the Arbatskaya Strelka, to the spit. Remember that connects Crimea with the mainland. So again, it's a dangerous point for the Germans, but Soviets are unable to expand on their successes. They built 3 defensive lines. Now they are almost resolved to just simply hold for the time being, to hold a static line. They are thinking of counteroffensive, But in Moscow, things are not looking so bright for the Soviet side anymore. We are now into February, and Soviet grandiose counteroffensive against the Army Group Center is pretty much failing at that point. There are more resources that Germans are able to bring in now that Barbarossa is anything but blitzkrieg. Hitler as much as declared at this point that blitzkrieg is a stupid word, and he never meant it as a blitzkrieg to begin with.
Sounds
so yeah. Of course, things are not doing so well, but of course it had been planned this way. Of course. So there are three defensive lines. One at the Parapach, that's where Arbatskaya Strelka connects with the isthmus. Then the next one is Nasir, and the last one, a very strong defensive position, is Sultanovka. That's the place closer to Kerch where old, probably Turkish fortification was built, and it's called Turkish Wall, or Tartar Wall sometimes. But typically by Soviets it's known as Turkish Wall. And because the Germans tried to attack, and very unsuccessfully, on the northern side of that Soviet-held position at Kerch, Soviets think that that's where the next attack, if it happens at all, would come. And Germans indeed are planning an attack very seriously. And there is even a name for it already, Trappinjagd, which means bastard hunt. Or sometimes I see it as a bird hunt, depending on how you like to translate it. But one way or the other, yes, the attack by Manstein, a very ambitious one, is coming. But think about it. Soviets have three armies packed in the Crimea, in the Kerch isthmus. There are 17 divisions of regular infantry divisions. There are 2 cavalry divisions. There are numerous support units. There are hundreds of tanks and something like 400 aircraft supporting this area. A whole new front is created just for that reason. It's now called Crimean Front. And people in charge, fortunately for the Germans, turned out to be complete incompetence. One of them is Kozlov, who is put in charge of the front. The other one is an interesting person, Mechlis, who is a political operative. He is second in command to Stalin himself. Yeah. He's deputy minister or narcom, commissar for defense. And he is the chief political officer of the entire Soviet army. Crimea is considered so important by the Soviet high command and Stalin himself that they send Mechlis there to take care of things, because things are obviously not progressing the way that Soviets wanted. Mechlis indeed takes care of things, but everybody around him absolutely detests and hates him. He has no proper military vision or education. And of course, together with Kozlov, they make mess of things. So when German attacked in this very insane, you could say, gambit, it succeeds beyond belief. What they did is they launched motorboats that were just small rubber boats operated by engineers to circumvent the first Soviet line at Parapach. The boats take off in moonlit light, so almost in full view of the Soviets. And so, in fact, Soviet patrol boat comes by very close and may have seen them.
It does nothing?
Does absolutely nothing. Goes away.
Okay.
They push out into the sea and wait just out of line of sight. In the morning, and we are talking 7th to 8th of May of 1942, a massive German artillery and rocket barrage begins at the line, and massive aerial attack by Stuka dive bombers. At that time, the air is clear, the weather became tolerable, passable for the German aviation. Up until that point, it was on and off, and in many cases, Germans simply did not have the aerial support they were so used to. But now they're in full control of the air. There's a massive attack, and at that same point, the troops that were in those rubber boats storm ashore, some 100 boats, and that makes a decisive difference. Now Soviet troops are fleeing in panic. One after another, all three defensive lines fall, they're punctured. Oh, there is a very fluid action. Soviets, even having probably the larger number of tanks, the estimates are somewhere close to 350 tanks in that positions versus maybe 180 German tanks, so twice as many tanks, unable to coordinate their actions. So those tanks, even better tanks than what Germans have at that point, the T-34s were, there was no match, they were no match for anything the Germans had. I mean, nothing Germans had was a match to T-34s. So every position falls, Soviet troops are retreating, and now it's a panic. Within days, Germans reach Kerch and capture it. So the entire peninsula is cleared. The remaining Soviet troops bunch up on the shore, expecting to be taken out by ships that ships never arrive. Stalin's order is to stand still no matter what, and when everything is lost, to continue fighting as partisans, to go into the gullies, to go into the caverns that pepper the shore of Crimea. Of course, well, good luck with that tactics. Most of them get slaughtered or captured prisoner. So at that point, the position of Sevastopol becomes very poor indeed. Now all the German attention can be safely brought back and aimed at their main goal, the capture of Sevastopol. And that is in fact one of the major goals of the campaign of 1942. They, at that point, already succeeded in destroying a very large number of Soviet troops in the Battle of Kharkov, the Second Battle of Kharkov, where a large pocket was formed and completely annihilated. They had other successes. They successfully repelled Soviet offensive at Moscow. Now it's a done deal. They eradicated many of the pockets that Soviets had in the rear of the Army Group Center. So that gives them extra breathing time and the ability to bring additional reinforcement. And now the storming of Sevastopol is ready to start in earnest.
Right.
Now the Germans are ready, they have the material, and material they had. And what I'm talking about now, there is a full realization that they're facing kind of Verdun situation. It's fully fledged World War I style warfare, which, by the way, Germans never expected and never could afford. This was not their war. They were fighting poor man's war. Their resources were never enough. It was kind of bandit assault, hoping to defeat your enemy very quickly. But contrary to popular belief, perhaps, Germans were never ready for World War II. Hitler never planned to start a war in 1939. He was sure that his personality would win, that British would ever stay on the sidelines, that they would not dare to intervene when Poland got attacked. He was pretty certain, at least initially, of his treaty with the Soviet Union, which was all but an ally of Nazi Germany at that point. So he did not expect that there would be a requirement for the German industries to produce the necessary amount of war materials. And it was dragging now, we're talking 1942, from 1939, so the war is in its third year. And things are looking pretty grim as far as the economic side of things for the Germans. So now Germans are faced with the siege warfare. Their major goal for 1942, one of them, is to capture finally Sevastopol, because it's becoming an embarrassment, among other things. And the number of Soviet troops there had grown, actually. They are constantly bringing reinforcements by submarines, by surface ships. They make hundreds of sorties back and forth, shuttle trips from Novorossiysk naval base in particular, bring reinforcements. And there is this constant threat of additional Soviet amphibious assaults. So what happened in 1941, late 41, may happen again. They know that it would eventually. So Sevastopol needs to be taken as quickly as possible. They bring massive artillery. And by massive, I mean enormous artillery pieces, likes of which the world had never seen up to that point. They bring naval guns, which would be considered very heavy artillery, but those are dwarfed by some of the larger pieces that they have. And we are talking now end of May, beginning of June. Again, the Crimean front, Soviet Crimean front, is out of the picture. Some 170,000 prisoners were taken just there. We are not talking about the rest of the campaign. We are not talking about Sevastopol now, although Sevastopol played a certain role, and there was the demonstrative attack, trying to help the situation, but it wasn't really the main effort. The main effort was supposed to be at Kerch. The Kerch force is gone now. There is nothing coming from the main Soviet position, from the mainland on the eastern side. Now the only route of supply for Sevastopol is, of course, by naval ships. And Germans build this line, roads and railroads that were essential for them and were sufficient to bring this enormous amount of artillery. There were, I made some notes about it, 12 so-called coastal howitzers that are 11 inches. That's a very large caliber, 11 inches. 12 14-inch howitzers. Now that would be considered light compared to everything else that they had. Among other things, there are 6 Gamma guns. The Gamma is what was known before as the Big Bertha.
The Big Bertha.
The Big Berthas that kept
why Gamma?
Paris, because they renamed they're probably at that point modernized, but this is a massive railway gun of the like that they used in World War I.
Yes.
To shell, even in 1918, there was a serious attack, as we know, on Paris that nearly succeeded. And they were actually keeping Paris under fire from this type of gun. And that fires 17, that has a 17-inch bore and fires a 1-ton shell. Imagine 1-ton shell.
I can imagine 17-inch bore.
No,
that's scary.
But wait, there is more. There are 3 Karls. Karl is a howitzer that's 21-inch wide, bore, 21-inch bore. The shell is 1.5 tons. This is a weapon that no Soviet fort, no fort on earth, can withstand. No. It punctures through, yards of concrete, basically, and it has very long range.
Long range.
Very long range. So
Germans was like 20 kilometers.
Yeah, something like that. And so Germans can safely install these weapons far from the line. What they do need is massive amounts of support and air support. They need basically their own air force to protect those guns because they're very stationary. They need a large number of railway cars. They need huge amount of support personnel. So it's not in their favor. They don't have the resources. They may not realize it yet, but they don't quite have the resources to spend this kind of people and materials on this one mission. But they're forced into the corner. And don't forget about Hitler's personality. He's forced with the challenge. Now he absolutely must show that he has
one-upmanship.
Exactly, the biggest balls. And on top of everything else, there is Dora. Now, Dora is a gun that requires 60 railway cars to deliver it to the assembly point. It can only be moved disassembled. It has 101-foot long barrel. I'm not talking about the length of the gun. Imagine the gun that has a 30-meter long barrel.
Oh,
This thing lobs a shell that weighs 7 tons. One shell, 7 tons of high explosives. And to make matters even worse for the Soviet side, there is Goliath. Now, Goliath is a very interesting weapon. You think that remotely operated drones is a thing of 21st century? You think this is the new item in this Ukrainian war that Russians started, and in Crimea in particular, where Ukrainian seaborne drones...
You're saying it just got cheaper?
It just got cheaper. Germans employ remotely operated little tanks that they called Goliath.
Tanks, yes.
They look very much like a World War I rhomboid tank.
Mm-hmm.
They are capable of carrying a very significant explosive warhead, ordnance, something like 150 pounds.
No.
So this thing, it has a pretty impressive for the time range of half a mile.
But Goliath or not, they weren't very big.
No, they were not big, and they were very slow, but they were safe to operate.
Right.
Because somebody could remain in the trenches, just watch through binoculars, and guided by wire. They were wire guided.
Of course, yes.
Yeah, not radio guided. And they would get to their target, and they didn't have to get directly on target. If this thing exploded, because of its massive amount of explosives, it could knock out a tank from many yards away, maybe as many as 30 yards, and the tank would be done. Of course, with a massive pillbox, they would need a shorter distance, but it was a very, very dangerous weapon for any stationary targets, and stationary targets is what Soviets had.
Right.
So employing this massive artillery, Manstein launches another assault. And it starts on June the 7th. It progresses pretty slowly initially. And it comes from 3 sides. In the center, Romanians are attacking. On the northern side, it's 65th Corps. And the rest of the German 11th Army is attacking from the southeast, from the northeast kind of direction. And they converge on Sevastopol from 3 sides. Now, in the north, the terrain is more kind of open. It's difficult over the entire area. It's very mountainous, hilly, lots of gullies, but it's a little bit more passable in the north, and this is where Germans have most of their success. And that's, by the way, where most of the artillery is concentrated. This is also the area where the heart of the harbor, where the harbor is, and where most of the Soviet forts are located. So they have to deal with it, and conveniently, that's where they bring the artillery to deal with those forts. In the south, it's much more difficult terrain. And also, in the center, the entire position is dominated by the hills, by Mount Sapun, which is main mountain in the immediate vicinity of Sevastopol. So in the south, Germans rely more on Goliaths to deal with the Soviet forts and with emplacements. In particular, there's one fort there that's very dangerous to them on the shore towards Balaklava, and that's Maxim Gorky. On the northern end, on the Black Sea, there's Maxim Gorky 1, on the southern Maxim Gorky 2, and there are many forts in between, mostly in the northern area. So, be it as it may, Romanians progress pretty satisfactorily, but the main success comes in the north. And even that is not enough to crack Soviet position. So eventually, Manstein resorts once again to a gambit, to a nearly crazy tactics. What he does is, and we will have to look in a minute at the map of the area, map of Sevastopol, again, very poorly drawn, please forgive me. If you are planning to attack Sevastopol anytime
Don't
soon,
use your
please
map.
do not rely on my map. but,
Yeah.
but for our purposes, it should be good enough. And I'll show you where those positions were and how the battle actually ended. It's a very poignant story. I mean, there was very heroic resistance from the Soviets, but in the end, Germans do succeed. And here's what I want to show. This is the map. So now, again, excuse very poor quality of this map, but for the illustration purposes, this is where the siege line pretty much is on June the 7th, the beginning of the German final assault on Sevastopol. The city at that point has something like 188,000 defenders. That's the beginning of the German assault. There would be some 25,000 reinforcements brought in by the low estimate, possibly more than that. But that lies ahead. First, they need to break through this massive line of fortifications. And I was mentioning Maxim Gorky 1. These main other forts lining, modern forts lining the outer perimeter of the city. We are not talking what's inside the city proper. Now, Malachov and all those other fortifications, they still exist, but they're much closer to the bay. This is the bay and the home of the Soviet Black Sea Fleet. The main area is here, Korabelnaya Buchta or Ship's Bay, right here. So if this falls, of course, there is no need to even try and hold Sevastopol any longer, obviously. But now it's modern war, so the fate of the city is decided really at these forts, Sapun Heights, right here, more or less, and Maxim Gorky 2, another very major fort, which is located on Cape Folland. So initially, the attack is very slow. It takes weeks for the Germans and Romanians to achieve any real first success. But on 23rd of June, they do reach the northern shore of the Severnaya Bay. So the Germans are now within proximity, within view of the city pretty much, across the narrow bay. And that's
how much are distances between here and there?
We are talking a few miles.
A few miles. So basically a big gun.
So they can see, if they are able to bring
Right.
big guns here, they will be shelling the city without a doubt. It will take a while. So they do have to press to come closer and to actually bring the war into the city proper, and that will decide the battle. So on 27th of June, they have a major success by attacking from the south. So in the beginning, as I said, that's where they had most artillery support, and they were successful initially. In the north, the 65th German Corps, 30th Corps and Romanian Mountain Corps now advance in the south. By the 27th of June, they are roughly here. That's the entire German position, much closer to the city. And Soviets are desperately bringing reinforcements. By 27th, it becomes apparent that all attempts to hold the city will probably fail. Germans are getting pretty frustrated too. Manstein went as far as to suggest that Germans should parachute. Now think about it. Parachute a captured British commander who was responsible for the defense of Tobruk in Africa. That Tobruk fell just a couple of days prior.
Right.
And his plan was to actually put the prisoner on the airplane, give him a parachute, and drop him on Sevastopol.
What would that achieve?
And they were thinking, okay, that will certainly sag Russian morale. Imagine,
little
did they know. Yeah. No, well, it was contrary to Geneva Conventions, and of course, Soviets were not part of it, but British very much were, and Germans. So that was ruled out, and also like insane impracticality of this plan, of course, was obvious to anybody. But Manstein has been ever in favor of gambits and unusual decisions. Actually proposed that to Hitler. be it as it may, 28th and 29th is that's when his another gambit actually works out. What he does is he launches another amphibious assault at night by a number of very small boats that cross the Severная Bay, almost in full view of the Soviets, but under the cover of darkness, they actually succeed in reaching the southern shore. And by the time the Soviets figure out what happened, Germans having very significant artillery support from the northern side, able to hold their position. At this point, the fate of Sevastopol is practically solved. It's going to fall. The Soviets already know that. The last major Soviet ship to reach the city comes on the 27th. And its name was Tashkent. It's a leader, which means large destroyer of the Black Sea Fleet. Interestingly and ironically enough, guess where it was built for the Soviet Union? It wasn't Soviet built. Almost. It was built by the fascist Italy in 1937. Like many other Soviet capital ships, especially the modern ones, they were built by their almost allies of Nazi Germany and fascist Italy and so forth. That ship unloads a naval infantry brigade. So you can see that even at the very last, almost the last minutes or days of the defense, Soviets were still bringing in reinforcements. They were practically on suicidal mission. But nonetheless, an entire infantry brigade, they take out something like 2,300, if I remember correctly, the number of civilians, of key personnel out of the city. Evacuate a large number of civilians. On the way back, the ship is subjected to an attack of total of maybe 300 Luftwaffe airplanes at one wave after another, not all together, but in total something like 300 attacks. There are hundreds and hundreds of bombs dropped on it. It somehow miraculously escapes being hit directly. Now, there are very many near misses. So the ship literally limps to port, barely afloat, with huge amount of water in its cargo bay. And most of the people on board survive. The ship's crew is cut to pieces. I once was lucky enough to head an order, the Order of the Red Banner, to the helmsman of that ship. And I read the award commendation and the list of people who got awarded, with specifically Order of the Red Banner, out of the crew of the ship. There were some 90 plus recipients of the Order of the Red Banner from the crew. There was a specific decree issuing awards just for the crew, just for that crew. You know how many of them were still alive at that point? Something like 25. A quarter of them survived. The ship, even though it reached port at Novorossiysk, was, as I said, barely afloat. It would have to have repairs. Marshal Budyonny, who was in charge of the southern area of operations, arrived on ship and gave a speech to the crew and was very impressed, and probably was instrumental in issuing the survivors high state awards. But a few days later, there was another Luftwaffe attack, 30 airplanes, attacking now immobilized ship at port and finally sinking it. But very heroic ship, nevertheless.
Yes.
And it was very instrumental. It just goes to show what it took to supply and how Soviets resisted to the very last minute. Then, for the remainder of the siege, there were still supplies by small craft, mostly by submarines, bringing reinforcements and taking some additional civilians and some army personnel. The top command was evacuated by air from Sevastopol, but within a few more days, it's over. On the 30th of June, Sapun Heights are finally captured. From there, Sevastopol is defenseless. And last fort on Cape Folin, the Maxim Gorky II, falls on July the 4th. That's when organized resistance ends. The city is now taken. the survivors of the Soviet garrison and their wives refused to surrender, go deep into the caverns that surround the fort or into the interior of the fort, and they are all methodically killed by German engineers with high explosives that are planted there. None of them comes back alive. And there is a small perimeter formed on Cape Chersones. Remember that location of the old Greek colony? Last desperate survivors of the Soviet maritime army make a stand there, hoping to be taken out by ships, by sea. Well, guess what? It's the same situation as a month earlier.
No ships came.
No ships came. They were all lost, taken prisoner. Okay. So in the end, the result of the campaign is the Germans are victorious. All the Crimea is now under their control. The remnants of Soviet Black Sea Fleet escaped to Novorossiysk, and then as Novorossiysk would be captured later, to Tuapse and Batumi, take refuge there. Germans succeeded, but at an enormous cost. And even though they captured something like 100,000 Soviet prisoners, inflicted tremendous amount of losses on the Soviet army, their losses are not inconsequential. And interestingly enough, you could almost say it was a Pyrrhic victory, because guess what? 11th Army ceased to exist. Manstein's 11th Army, that was so victorious, that overran Crimea in the early days of November, that almost succeeded in taking Sevastopol in as early as 1941, that resisted Soviet push from Kerch, and on and on and on. It was bled white. It was taken out of the German order of battle, and really never reconstituted until much, much later as a Panzer Army.
What about Manstein himself?
Manstein himself did great. There were celebrations in his honor. There was a parade that, by the way, was partly spoiled by the Soviet aviation that made an attack right at that time, conveniently out of Kuban.
Right.
And there was even a special award. We are talking about main subject, and I know I digress a lot, but the main subject of our discussion is the Soviet medal for the defense of Sevastopol. Right. There were other awards beside that. There was, of course, Hero Star and the title of Hero City bestowed upon Sevastopol 20 years later, in 1965 actually, just before the May Day, on 8 May 1965, I'm sorry. And you know what was happening by that time. Khrushchev was out, Stalin was forgotten, Brezhnev was in, and in 1965 the city is given special status. So there was another award of the Hero Star, and actually Order of Lenin that came visit, that were given to the city of Sevastopol. But there was one more award, and you may not know about it. Some of our Soviet collectors do know. It's a German award for Crimea, so-called Crimean Shield. So if we talk about Soviet medal for the defense of Sevastopol, we have to at least briefly mention this very interesting campaign medal, essentially, that would be worn by the German troops who participated in the campaign. And compliments of our friend Jean de Woer. We have one from his personal collection. It's not a common piece.
Let's put it in.
And it's just nice to have an original here.
Oh, like this.
The fabric is from cut out from a German soldier's
trench
tunic.
coat.
Yeah, or tunic. Let's look at the back.
Rubberized.
And front, and you can see the dates, 41, 42. That's how long it took, Krim in German. And you know, there were not many like this. It was one of the campaign awards the German instituted specifically for the campaigns that were won just barely against enormous odds. One other, the earlier one, was Narvik in Norway. There was another one that was really touch and go for the Germans. It was a pocket, a Demyansk pocket, one of the longest running campaigns, but initially it was a near fiasco because before it was a bulge, it was actually a pocket. And Germans really played a gamble by trying to supply it successfully with their aerial supplies and re-establishing contact with the mainland. So there was a similar shield for that, and there were a couple of others. But Crimea just goes to show how difficult this campaign was for the Germans.
Yeah.
It was really won in much part by the bravado, partly because of the incompetence of some of the Soviet commanders, because Soviet troops were not yet battle ready necessarily, or experienced enough at least. But it was a very, very close running thing. So now that we have the German award out of the picture, let's get to our main subject. Our main subject is, of course, Soviet medal for the defense of Sevastopol. And as I promised, we have 3 pieces here.
Okay, let's put them in focus.
We have 3 pieces. I will have to tell you, spoil the secret, one of them is a fake.
Oh, you already spoiled the secret, but it made me even more curious which one.
And this is what I
have a
like.
suspicion it's not the shiniest one.
Okay, let's get there. One clue that I want to mention right from the beginning: don't pay any attention to the suspension device. People sometimes are naive enough to think that if suspension is new, like this, then it must be a fake. Well, there's nothing easier than to replace suspension. And even if the connecting link is sorted, looks like one single piece, there is a connection there. And it's very easy for an experienced jeweler to make that connection without anybody noticing.
Right.
So reconnect the link. So that doesn't guarantee you anything in the least. Also, even with the connecting link intact, the medal can be taken out. The suspension is such that there's an opening in the suspension itself, so it can be disassembled. So this is not a factor in any way, shape, or form, but we'll get there. So now the medal. It's one of the first defensive campaign medals instituted by the Soviet Union in World War II. It came pretty early in the game. The first medals were only issued in 1943. It was instituted in 1942. And at the same time, there were other medals introduced, and this was an entirely new idea, actually. Soviet Union did not have many medals, and certainly not campaign medals before. The other ones were Defense of Leningrad. There was a medal for the defense of Odessa, the earlier campaign. And the other one was the battle that was most famous and was ongoing at the same time is Stalingrad. So 4 defensive campaign medals, and Sevastopol is one of them, and one of the hardest to get because there were so few survivors. At the end of the campaign, we don't know how many people were taken out from the city, how many military men were evacuated by the Black Sea Fleet. But many of them were, and some fought again in Crimea. And there are cases when you have a group of 3 awards, 3 documents to the same man for 3 different campaigns: Odessa, Sevastopol, and then Caucasus. Those are unlikely survivors of all 3.
Right.
And that so-called Southern Ball, as Russian collectors call it. And it's very nice to have one of those in the collection. But certainly a certain number of troops were saved and fought another day. In the end, there were something like, depending on the source, some say 30,000 medals issued. I know a source that claims that there were 50,000. This is official Soviet source as of late 1970s. So we could expect that probably there were some additional awards in the interim after the end of 1970s to 1980s. Some catch-up awards, without a doubt, and maybe into even post-Soviet period. I wouldn't exclude that. Some people, for whatever reason, couldn't prove that they were there and eventually could. Or found documentary proof, or just simply didn't care before, and now they came up with the proof that they were eligible for the medal. But with all of that in mind, there must have been no more than 55,000-60,000 survivors of that campaign still alive in the 70s, 80s, and in the post-war period. So we are talking about a very small number out of the initial huge number of troops that took part. Again, it's 188,000 strength, despite the Soviet claims, but real strength of the Soviet garrison inside the city as of May or beginning of June of 1942. We are talking another 25,000 reinforcements. We are talking another who knows how many, who counts, that were there, brought there in the interim before May of 19.
Right.
So well over 200,000 without a doubt, 280,000 maybe altogether that took part, and very small number of survivors. So it's a pretty uncommon medal. And because it's uncommon, and because the campaign is so famous, because it's Crimea, of Crimean warfare, it has always been very popular among collectors. And because of that, it's always quite valuable, comparatively speaking, compared to other Soviet campaign medals. Right. And because of that, it's very, very often faked. And today, we finally will get to, now your patience is rewarded, and we now talk about the medal itself, not about something else. Now, look at these three, and this is very important to understand in general what we are looking at when we are dealing with fakes. Now, there are two major variations of this medal. One of them is the variation 1 common to construction to all early Soviet campaign medals, to all of the variation 1 campaign medals. It has a separate sorted eyelet at the top. Mm-hmm. So this eyelet here is a separate part which is sorted to the rest of the medallion.
Right.
Same here. So all three medals that we have here are variation 1. There are differences within that variation. The very early version of it, which I don't have right now, but I'll illustrate how it looks, and we have a picture. It doesn't have this border around the medallion. You see this raised border around the medallion?
Yes.
This is characteristic of the second subvariation. Second subvariation of variation 1, the border around the medallion. Then within that subvariation, there are two varieties as well, yes, to make matters even more confusing. Okay. And what I'm talking about is specific details of the artwork. And rather than to try and show them here, I will first want to show it on another sketch of mine. Sorry, I have to torture you again with my notations and sketches. Okay, but here's what I'm talking about. So no border variation, very early. It has only single version. The second border variation, such as what we have here, has two varieties. One of the distinguishing features is how the cap tally of the sailor's cap looks. You see there is a sailor and the soldier.
Right.
And the sailor is wearing this biskazirka cap with the cap tally. See the ends of the tally? Okay.
Yes.
If you take a very close look at it, the ends
forked.
Is forked. The end of one of the ends of the tally, let's put it this way, is forked. This is characteristic of the earlier version of the medal, both no border variation and the first subversion of the border variation has this feature, has this swallowtail end of the tally. The second end of the tally is kind of coming to a sharp end, like this. Okay, so that's one very important and very visible feature. The other noticeable feature is how distant are the two loose ends of the cap tally are from each other. On the earlier version, they're kind of wider spaced. On the second version, these ends of the tally, both of them, are blunt. So the tally kind of curves onto itself, okay? And this is how it looks on the second version, and also the loose ends of the tally are much closer together. There are some other differences to pay attention to, but
these are probably the most
these are the most obvious
discernible,
ones. Yes,
right.
yes, definitely the most obvious one. And then just to finish with the discussion of the variations, there is of course the second variation, major variation, which is Voenkomat. In the case of Sevastopol medal, because there were so few survivors, there was apparently no need, at least initially, to produce a post-war, what would be considered variation 2 on most other campaign medals that Soviets had, such as Defence of the Polar Region, number of others, many of the, actually all of the liberation campaign medals, such as Warsaw, Prague, Belgrade, and so forth. They had this U-shaped eyelet variation 2, and variation 3 was what considered Voenkomat, meaning military committee issues, much later post-war issues. With Sevastopol, we go straight from variation 1 with separate eyelet to Voenkomat variation 2, and Voenkomat looks pretty much, generally speaking, the same construction-wise as any Soviet Jubilee medal. It has a rounded eyelet that's struck as one single piece as the medallion. So that being said, returning to the fakes. And here's the curious thing that what we will see. So you see the raised edge on all three medals. So far so good. You see sorted eyelet. So far so good. And you see the age, and you say one of them is more shiny than the others. Well, all three have patina. All three have age.
Okay.
The fake, another giveaway, came from a very old collection in the United States. A collection that makes me certain that the fake is at least 25, 30 years old. So they've been fake for a very long time. Age is not a factor. You cannot tell by age alone. Yes, of course, it's shiny, it's obvious. But patina, tarnish, don't really matter. What we notice, however, if you compare the three, see how all of them have wear, but look how articulated, nevertheless, the inscription is on this one.
Thinner lines of letters and very high precision.
Yes. Absolutely. If you look at the finer details, and we will get to that, you will see how not only the inscription is articulated, it doesn't have real wear to it that you would expect. If the medal is worn, you would expect the writing, the raised lettering, to be worn as well. You don't see it here. You will also notice that some of the lines are kind of screwed up. And in general, I compare the appearance of these three. And now let's look at the front side, the obverse. What you will notice on this one in the center is the absolute lack of that shiny areas that I was talking about. Even if a medal is worn, if you see a lot of dings and scratches everywhere, the surface, you will find very flat areas, especially right next to the raised artwork.
Right.
Shiny areas that remained untouched pretty much, and they're exactly like they were when the medal left the mint. Here, you don't see all that much wear on the background, but if you take a very close look, you see this kind of graining all over the background. This grain that should really be there. It should be shiny. It should be absolutely flat and shiny. In fact, it's very, very grainy. Another very common feature of the fakes is the, remember Biskazirka tallies that we were talking about? there's always a very noticeable dividing line between the two of them. Here. See?
Yes.
One of them
Is on top of the
is
other.
on top of the other.
Right.
They don't really join together. They don't become one. Now here, if you look at this one, what do you see? There's practically no division. They merge.
No, they merge.
They merge. They merge near,
Yep, there
closer
they
to
are.
the. Okay, so good one. And then bad one to compare.
Mhm.
And you see how the two tallies join
Right.
near the cap. There is no dividing line. There are very many other differences. Again, you can see the grain very well here, all over the place. You can see this small kind of bubbles that come up, and this is a result of die casting. That's why I'm saying it's such a perfect fake. You see other inconsistencies. For example, in the artwork, you see how on the original medals, the ends of the cannon look like breech side of the cannon.
Yes.
It should be original. It should be very nicely defined as this, little balls. Here they're misshapen, and that's not because of the wear. Another thing that you will notice is on this one, unlike the others, the border of which I was talking is kind of destroyed here. It's not continuous. It's not straight. And let's try and see if we can catch it with more light. But look at this area here. See, this border is uneven and it kind of disappears. So that's another thing
Sinks in.
that's certainly a giveaway. So altogether, then small things such as details of the uniform. See how they disappear here versus on the original medal, like this Tilnyashka shirt, the striped shirt of the sailor. It's almost like you can't really tell if it's stripes or some kind of just things there. But on the original, these are really stripes.
Right. Yep.
These are really stripes. They are parallel to each other more or less. So original, fake, lack of details.
Yes.
Details are incorrect. Look at the top of the cannon. Fake. See how this cannon looks unnatural, the end of the cannon? This is not how the muzzle really looks. Now look at the original. Very, very natural, to me at least, barrel-like look.
Right.
Fake, original.
Yes.
So, what I like about this fake is that there are so many things that make
wrong
it.
with
And
it.
finally, the last one, the last but maybe not least. It's very hard to see this. There will be a picture that I encourage everybody to look at. The edge of the medal. Here, I think we can maybe get an idea. See these lines? Perpendicular
Yes.
lines, right? It's not my imagination.
Right,
You can
no.
actually see them. All right. They should not appear on a regional medal of the Soviet period. Now, that being said, you see them on imperial medals because the process was the manufacturing process was different. So you do see a little bit. They are not very accentuated. They are not very exaggerated. There's just kind of a shadow in some areas. And that's actually a very good sign for an imperial Russian medal. For the Soviet medal, the edge should be smooth. There are no lines. Nobody finished this edge by hand. There were no lines as a result of a strike. You see, you won't find any of those perpendicular lines or any kind of finishing lines on the original medal, but you do occasionally see them on a fake. And this fake is case in point. It's almost like as if it was finished by hand, which they never did with the regional campaign medals in the Soviet era. And in general, look how unnatural this edge looks, like perfectly smooth. I'm not talking about lines, but otherwise there is no wear to it.
Right.
right? Or the wear is very unnatural. There may be a ding or two, but here's how the regional edge should look because of all the wear, because people wore this medal on the uniform. The recipient actually wore it. It wasn't just sitting in a closet. So if you see wear on the front and back of the medal, you expect to see it on the edge too, and this is what fakers often forget to add. So this, I hope, makes you more equipped in the future in dealing with the fakes. Now, all of that being said, don't expect that all of them will be as easy as this one. This one is fortunate case because it combines very many characteristics of a fake.
Well, then I have a question. If you, for example, just a theoretical, if you see one hint of one of those fake features on a medal, just one, and everything else is perfectly authentic, what do you decide?
My advice to you?
Yes.
Stay away. If you are not sure, stay away.
Okay.
Don't waste your money. Don't get lured.
I'm talking about
it's not the last medal you're ever going to see.
Technologically, there's got to have been some
If you
sort
see this uneven surface everywhere on the medal, this graining in places where it shouldn't be, it may come from pitting, in theory, but I would just stay away. You don't know if it's a
No,
fake.
of course, I wouldn't.
If any of the details is wrong compared, any of the fine details such as tops of the barrels that we discussed, muzzle part of the barrel, wrong lettering and some imperfections, sometimes wavy lines in the lettering, in the lines that form the letters.
Right.
If you see any of that, even one thing, absolutely stay away. Absolutely stay away. It's almost for certain a fake because stamp is a stamp. Soviet medals were stamped, never die cast. So if there is an error,
how many matrices were there?
Very good question. That's the reason for variations in many of them, but not so much in Sevastopol because so few of Sevastopol medals were made to begin with. With Sevastopol, we are dealing with just 3 versions of variation 1. 2 versions I must mention of variation 2 Voenkomat because one of them, quite rare, has a flat eyelet. That one is probably dating from the 50s, or I would say no later than 50s, and it has somewhat flat eyelet. It's not like typical U-shaped early variation 2 of most other medals.
Right.
It's really a Voenkomat, but the eyelet is noticeably flat. So quite rare. But still, we are dealing with just 3. There was no need ever to produce a lot of them. Rare medals, the beauty of rare medals is that there were so few stamps. So few were needed because they didn't have time, a chance to get worn out. They were not produced at different places. Typically, it was just one mint, not several locations. And another reason is that there were just so few made. So yes, excellent question. But
thank you.
Yes, that for that reason, if it deviates at all from the known standard, stay away. Stay away. There's no point of wasting your money. And usually when you start looking into those things, typically when I judge a medal, whether it's original or not, I look at it, I see one of those warning signs, I either immediately reject it, or if I have to, I start looking for others, and guess what?
You find them.
I find them. Of course, because they don't stand scrutiny. Fakes are never perfect. It's impossible to produce a perfect fake, even with the most modern of technology. Doesn't matter. They will never be able to build Moscow Mint of 1945 standard, populated by people who worked at that mint then, teach them how to work the machinery, find machinery that existed at that
in
time.
the same condition.
In the same condition. You understand what?
Of course.
What a pile of impossibilities.
To manufacture.
Yes, you can. You can laser cut one. You can make a very nice impression.
I'm thinking 3D print.
3D print. Yes, but it's never going to be like the original. It's going to be different materials. It will have a completely different look. It may replicate some of the features of the originals, but it will never replicate them all.
technical impossibility. Even the islet, think about it. It's a separate part.
Right. Yeah.
Material, where you find exact same composition, so it has exact same look. Very difficult. You would have to melt other metals. Well, they'll still be compromised as far as chemical composition.
Yep.
So no, it's quite an impossible task. All right. So that being said, last part of our discussion will be on sizes, and I said a million times already that size and weight should not be the main determining factor, but we'll return to that in a little while. But nevertheless, it would be very instructive, I think, to look at the sizes and weights of the medals that we handled in recent past. And I say recent, that's over the course of many years, of several years at least. Sevastopol medal is scarce. We don't find it very often. I'm lucky to have 2 right now, but it's not a common thing to have 2 at the same time even. So look at this. Variation 2 flat eyelet, the one that I mentioned, the scarce version, 37.2 millimeter in height. And typically I don't measure height because that varies widely, but in this case I did. Width 32.2. And we will really concentrate on the width because it's the most interesting, most important factor. Weight of all Soviet medals varies very drastically on originals, but width not so much. So variation 1 with the border 32.2. Variation 2 with the border 32. Regular variation 2 Voenkomat 32.1. Variation 2 32.1. And on and on. And look at the very interesting pattern. All of them, with maybe one exception that was 32.0, are either 32.1 or 32.2, regardless of what version they were. Variation 1 with border, variation 2 flat island, regular variation 2, quite a number of them, variation 1 without border, with border, all of them very consistently 32.2, 32.1, and really nothing other than that. Right. As far as the weight, much less consistency, of course.
Wear and metal.
It's not even that. It's the thickness of the sheet, and the specific angle at which that sheet is fed into the machinery plays a big role. There are just too many factors. Eyelet, of course, plays a certain role. So 14.2, 17.2, 16.5, pretty widely dispersed, but still, I mean, around, more or less 16 gram, give or take, plus minus maybe 1.5. That's all the deviation we get. 15.10, 15.6, 16.3. Interestingly, I had in my hands once a medal that's featured in McDaniel's Comprehensive Guide to Soviet Orders and Medals. Certainly a standard example to compare all the others against. And guess what? The width of that medal was 32.1. Difference of that. You can't escape. So this is a pretty good factor. And let's just do a test on the ones that we have here. If you can grab that micrometer for me, please. Thank you very much. Let's look. Put it at 0, hopefully. Yeah. And let's take a look. .2 and 32.3. That's a bit high.
Are you zeroed?
Yeah, let me see. 32.2. But still within tolerance, I would say. 32. Oh, wait a minute. 32. Stop. 32.2. There we go. No, that's the 32.17. I never measure them to the 100th because it's meaningless. Every time you'll get a different reading. Let's look at the other one. Guess what? 32.1. Well, let's look at the fake, just for the heck of it.
Pretty good. 32.
No.
31.7. What do you mean?
31.7.
Right.
Do you see anything that's close to 31.7?
No. No.
32.1.
32.0 is
The ones we just
right.
tested were
Right.
32.1, 32.2.
Consistently.
31.7 nowhere on this
Yes.
list of some
Correct.
20 medals
Yep.
that I measured is 31.7.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another giveaway. Again, don't expect all fakes to be so easy. This is an old cast replica, and this is a casting error that they shrink. These are the old methods of casting. There are modern methods, unfortunately, where the medal will be of the absolute correct size, even if it's a cast copy. They found a way of making better fakes. But at least if you see something that far off the charts, then you know something is wrong. Start
Right.
looking for other problems.
Yep.
And better if you don't have time, if you're at a show somewhere, you measure that. Definitely carry this tool with you. It's no big deal. Somewhere in your backpack, you know. And if it's this far off, stay away.
Yeah.
You don't have to put even $100 or $200. It may look like a bargain, but your chances of losing are much greater than your chances of winning.
Right.
If you
Okay.
don't know the source,
Lesson learned.
it's best to stay away.
Mm-hmm.
All
Thank you
right.
so much.
Well,
Thank you.
that concludes our discussion today on the Soviet medal for the defense of Sevastopol. Hope I didn't put you all to sleep.
No.
But perhaps it will be, interesting enough course, sort of,
It was certainly
specifically
very interesting
figuring
part
out.
of the war, and
Yeah.
very interesting.
Yeah, I think it deserved
rare
real
medal.
special
Yeah,
conversation because it was such a heroic
Certainly.
campaign.
Certainly. I really appreciate it. Good to be a part of it.
All right.
Okay.